Jonathan Whittaker had walked that hallway 1,000 nights without once pausing at his wife's door. But tonight, he heard his own name spoken, not in anger, not in accusation, but in a whisper so tender it stopped the breath in his chest. She was praying for him. The man who had treated her like a polite inconvenience for 12 months. The man who had never once asked if she was well. His hand rose toward the door and then fell back to his side. If this story moved something in you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The summer of 1814 settled over the Whittaker estate, like something that had given up trying to be gentle. The heat came in through every window, whether the windows were open or not. The fields beyond the east fence had gone the color of old straw. The creek that ran along the property line had pulled itself back to a thin silver thread. The roses along the south wall, the ones Jonathan's mother had planted with her own hands 17 years ago, had gone half wild without anyone to tend them. Nobody had tended much of anything on the Whittaker estate in a long time. Jonathan Whittaker walked the hallway of his own house at 11:30 at night, the way a man walks a stretch of road. He's traveled so many times he no longer sees it. His boots were quiet on the floorboards. His injured right hand, the one a British musket ball had torn through outside of Baltimore 2 summers back, ached in the Virginia heat, the way it always ached when the air refused to move. He carried a candle in his left hand. He was heading nowhere in particular, which was where he spent most of his nights. He had stopped sleeping well the year he came home from the war. He had stopped a good many things the year he came home from the war. The door to Abigail's room was on the left side of the hallway, third from the end. It was always closed. Jonathan had never knocked on it. He had no occasion to. They shared a house, a last name, and a dining table 3 mornings a week when their schedules aligned. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. He didn't think about her much. At least that was what he told himself. He was 3 steps past her door when he heard it. Not a cry, not a complaint, not the sound of something breaking in the dark. A voice, low and steady and unhurried the way a woman speaks when she believes she is alone and has no reason to perform for anyone. Jonathan stopped, his candle flame bent sideways, catching the draft from the hallway window. He turned his head. Through the wood of the closed door, through the thick summer silence of the Whittaker house, he heard his own name come out of his wife's mouth, like it was something she'd been carrying a long time, and had only just found a safe place to set down. Lord, I ask that you ease the pain in Jonathan's hand tonight. The weather is heavy, and I know it troubles him, though he would never say so. Jonathan did not move. I ask that you bring Thomas back into correspondence with his brother. Jonathan grieves that quarrel more than he lets on. He is too proud to write first, and Thomas is too stubborn to forgive without being asked, and I fear they will waste years that neither of them can afford to waste. He stood in the hallway of his own home with a candle in his left hand, and something happened in his chest that he did not have a word for. I ask that you give Jonathan 1 night this week where he doesn't wake before dawn. 1 full night. He was a good man before the war took something from him, and I believe that man is still in there, even when he makes it very hard to believe. The silence after her words was the loudest thing Jonathan Whittaker had heard since Baltimore. He stood there a full minute, maybe longer, with his hand raised toward that door, and his body absolutely unable to decide what to do with itself. Everything in him wanted to knock. Everything in him was also deeply humiliatingly certain that he had no right to knock. That he had forfeited whatever right a man had to walk through his wife's door 12 months ago when he'd looked at her on their wedding morning and decided she was a transaction. He lowered his hand. He stepped back from the door. He carried his candle back down the hallway and sat down in his study and stared at the wall until the candle burned itself out. Buzz. Abigail Mercer Whittaker had arrived at the Whittaker estate on a Thursday morning in July of 1813 in a hired carriage with 2 trunks. A letter of introduction from her father that was already out of date because her father had died 3 weeks prior, and the very deliberate intention of not crying in front of strangers. She had managed that much. She was 23 years old, the eldest daughter of a Virginia family that had once had a good name and a moderate fortune, and had spent the last decade quietly losing both. When the Whittaker arrangement was proposed, Jonathan Whittaker needed a respectable wife to satisfy the terms of his father's estate, and the Mercer family needed the kind of connection that would keep creditors from appearing at their door. Abigail had been the one to say yes, not because she was told to, though she was told to, because she had looked at the situation clearly and decided that a difficult marriage to a man she didn't know was still a better outcome than watching her mother and younger sisters lose the house by winter. She was practical that way. She was also, under the practicality, considerably more hopeful than she allowed most people to see. Jonathan Whittaker had not made hope easy. He had been polite enough on their wedding day. He had shaken her hand afterward, which she found odd, but chose not to remark upon. He had shown her the house, explained which rooms were hers, and then excused himself to his study, where he remained for the better part of the next 6 hours. At supper, he spoke about the weather and the state of the east fence. He asked if her room was comfortable. She said it was. He nodded. They ate the rest of the meal in silence. That was how it had gone more or less for a year. He was not cruel. She wanted to be accurate about that even in her own mind. He never raised his voice. He never said a single harsh word. He simply treated her the way a man treats furniture he chose for a practical reason, with adequate maintenance and no particular attachment. She had cried about it exactly once in October alone in the orchard, where she was fairly certain no one could hear her. Then she had dried her face and gone back inside, and figured out who on the estate staff she needed to talk to in order to get his breakfast prepared the way he actually liked it, which was not the way the cook had been preparing it for the past 3 years. If she was going to live here, she was going to live here. She had decided that. She was going to learn every corner of this house. She was going to learn what it needed. She was going to tend the roses along the south wall because somebody had to, and they had been her mother-in-law's, and it seemed disrespectful to let them go entirely to ruin. She was going to write to Thomas Whittaker, Jonathan's younger brother, who had stopped corresponding with the estate after a quarrel that everyone on staff knew about, and no one would explain to her because she had a feeling Thomas was waiting for someone to extend a hand rather than a grievance. She didn't do any of this to impress Jonathan. She did it because the house needed it, because the people on this estate needed someone paying attention, because she had been raised to believe that you took care of the place you lived in whether or not anyone noticed. She had not in 12 months expected Jonathan Whittaker to notice. He noticed on a Friday morning in late July, the morning after the prayer. He came down to breakfast and stood in the doorway of the morning room and looked at the table. Then he looked at it again the way a man looks when something is familiar, but he can't place why. The biscuits were on the left side. The butter was already softened. There was coffee, not tea. The window facing east was open exactly 2 inches, which was enough to let the morning air through without blowing the papers he sometimes brought with him. He had eaten this breakfast approximately 240 times without once asking who had arranged it this way. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said. Abigail was already at the sideboard pouring coffee into a second cup. She turned with the same composed expression she always wore in his presence. Not cold, not warm, simply steady. Like someone who had decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to need his approval to get through a day. "Good morning," she said. "Did you instruct the kitchen about my breakfast?" She set the coffee cup down near his place at the table. "I made some adjustments when I first arrived. I hope they haven't been an inconvenience." "How did you know how I take my coffee?" A brief pause. "I observed." He pulled out his chair but didn't sit. "You've been observing me." "I've been paying attention," she said, which was a different thing, and something in her tone made it clear she knew it was a different thing. "You are my husband," it seemed reasonable. Jonathan sat down. He looked at his breakfast. He thought about the prayer. He thought about the year he had spent eating this breakfast without once questioning its arrangement. He thought about what that said about him and found the answer uncomfortable. "The orchard," he said. "I beg your pardon. The east orchard, my mother's orchard. Someone has been tending it." Yes, Abigail said. I have. Why? She looked at him with something that was almost patience and almost exasperation, and she chose her words carefully, the way someone chooses their footing on uncertain ground. Because it was beautiful once, she said, and because the things people love deserve to be kept, even after the people are gone. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. My mother planted those trees, he said. I know. Margaret told me. Margaret was the housekeeper. The fact that Abigail was on familiar terms with Margaret's name, with Margaret's knowledge of this family, was information Jonathan processed slowly, like a man reading a document in poor light. I owe you an apology, he said. The words came out before he had fully decided to say them, which was unusual for him. He was a man who decided things before he said them, or he had been before the war. Abigail set down her coffee cup. She looked at him without flinching. For what specifically? For treating you as though you weren't here. You mean for a year, she said. Not cruelly, just accurately. Yes, he said. For a year. She was quiet for a moment. The morning air moved through the open window. Somewhere outside, one of the stable hands was talking to a horse. Mr. Whitaker, she said. And the formality of it after a year of marriage landed on him like a small, cold stone. I appreciate that you've said so. I do. But shame is not the same as love, and I have been waiting long enough to be able to tell the difference. She picked up her coffee cup and walked out of the morning room and left him sitting with his perfectly arranged breakfast. Jonathan Whitaker spent the better part of that day doing something he hadn't done in 12 months, thinking about his wife. Not as an arrangement, not as a situation, as a person. He walked the east orchard in the afternoon, where the peach trees his mother had planted were trimmed and watered and bearing fruit despite the dry summer. He walked the linen room where he noticed for the first time that it smelled of lavender and that the lavender was fresh. He stopped in the front parlor and looked at the small writing desk near the window where Abigail apparently spent her mornings, and noticed the stack of letters beside the inkwell, and noticed with a start the handwriting on the top letter, Thomas. The letter was from his brother, Thomas. Jonathan stood there with the letter in his hand, reading the return address twice to make sure he hadn't made a mistake. Thomas Whitaker, Philadelphia. He turned the letter over. Abigail's name was on the front. He set it down. He was not in the habit of reading his wife's correspondence. But the fact of the letter, the fact that Thomas had written that Thomas was apparently writing to Abigail with some regularity, that the brother who had stopped communicating with the Whitaker estate entirely after their quarrel 18 months ago, was now in correspondence with the wife. Jonathan had barely spoken to that fact, sat in the middle of his chest like something he needed to understand. He found Abigail in the garden an hour later. She was cutting roses off the south wall, the older ones that had bloomed and begun to drop their petals. She had a cloth basket over her arm and a pair of small cutting shears in her right hand, and she was working with the brisk, specific attention of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Thomas, Jonathan said. Abigail clipped a spent bloom and laid it in the basket. Good afternoon. He's been writing to you. Yes. How long? Since February. Jonathan absorbed that. February was 6 months ago. 6 months of letters between his wife and his estranged brother, and he had not known about a single one. What does he say? Abigail turned to look at him. She assessed him for a moment with those steady dark eyes, the way she had been doing since the morning room, as though she was taking his measure and hadn't yet decided what it came out to. He says he misses his brother, she said. He says he doesn't know how to unsay the things that were said. He says he is waiting for someone to find a way through. Why didn't you tell me? I tried, she said. 3 times in March. You were unavailable. He stopped. I was busy. Yes, she said. You were busy. And she turned back to the roses. Jonathan stood there, feeling the full weight of that statement, which was not an accusation, but was somehow worse than an accusation, because it was simply true. He had been busy. He had been busy with his fields and his accounts, and the persistent miserable ache in his right hand. And his wife had been 3 times to his study door to tell him something important about his brother, and he had not been available. "I'd like to read the letters," he said, "if you'll allow it." "They're Thomas's letters," she said. "I'll ask him. He's my brother. He's writing to me." She clipped another bloom. "I'll ask him." Jonathan breathed out slowly through his nose. "You're not going to make this easy, Mr. Whitaker," Abigail said, setting down her shears and turning to face him fully with the basket on her arm and a slightly faded rose in her free hand and the summer heat pressing down on both of them. "I spent 12 months learning the exact temperature of your coffee and the precise angle at which you prefer the east window and the name of every man on your estate staff and the birthday of your housekeeper's youngest daughter. I have done all of that without a single word of acknowledgement, let alone thanks. I have been a wife to this house in every way I knew how, while being less than a stranger in my own husband's estimation." She wasn't crying. She was very far from crying. Her voice was level and clear, and she looked him directly in the eye without any particular expression except honesty. "So, no," she said. "I am not going to make this easy. Because easy is what you've had from me for a year, and look where easy got us." She picked up her shears and went back to the roses. Jonathan Whitaker stood in the summer heat of his own garden and felt for the first time in a very long time something that might have been the beginning of respect. He did not sleep that night either. He lay in the dark of his room and thought about the prayer. He thought about 6 months of letters. He thought about lavender in the linen room, and peach trees trimmed with careful hands, and breakfast arranged according to observations made in silence, because no one had bothered to make them welcome. He thought about what Abigail had said at their wedding, the part he'd barely listened to, because he'd been thinking about the estate accounts and the terms of his father's will. He tried to remember her face at the ceremony, and found with a cold shock that he could barely call it up. He had looked at her and seen a solution to a problem. He had looked at her and seen nothing else. And she had looked at him and apparently decided that he was worth praying for anyway. He didn't understand that. He wasn't sure he deserved to understand it. At some point near 3 in the morning, he got up and went to his writing desk and pulled out a piece of paper. He sat there for a long time with the pen in his good hand. Then he wrote 2 words at the top of the page. "Dear Thomas." He sat with those 2 words for a while. Then he kept going. He wrote slowly because his thoughts were not accustomed to moving in this direction. He wrote about the quarrel and about his own part in it, which was larger than he had ever allowed himself to admit. He wrote about the estate and about the last year and about a woman he had married for convenience who had spent 12 months becoming indispensable without once demanding to be recognized for it. He didn't know quite what he was writing. A confession, maybe. An accounting. The kind of letter a man writes when he's finally honest with himself about what he's been doing with his time. He signed it, "Your brother Jonathan," which he had not written in over a year, and he sealed it, and he set it on his desk. Then he went back to bed, and for the first time since Baltimore slept until the sun came up. Margaret the housekeeper found Jonathan in the hallway outside Abigail's door at 7 the following morning. He was standing there with a cup of coffee in his left hand, prepared the way Abigail took it, which he'd had to ask the kitchen about, which had caused a brief and slightly confused conversation with the cook, and his right hand raised as though he'd been about to knock, and then reconsidered. Margaret looked at the cup, then at his face, then at the door. "She's awake," Margaret said. "Been up since 6. She takes her breakfast in the garden on Saturdays." "I know," Jonathan said. He didn't know. He had not known a single thing about his wife's routines until 48 hours ago, and he was not proud of that. "Margaret." "Sir." "In your estimation." He stopped, reconsidered. "Has she been all right this past year? Has anyone been unkind to her?" Margaret gave him the particular kind of look that a woman who has worked for a family for 23 years gives a man who has just asked a question 23 years too late. It was not a mean look. It was simply a look that understood a great deal and was choosing its words accordingly. "She's been lonely, Mr. Whitaker," Margaret said. "But she's not the kind that lets lonely make her bitter. She turns it into work instead. Practical woman." "Yes," Jonathan said. "She is. It's a quality," Margaret said, "that deserves to be appreciated rather than taken advantage of." "I know," Jonathan said. "I'm beginning to understand that." He went to the garden. Abigail was seated on the stone bench near the south wall, the one that caught the morning shade before the heat moved in, with her own cup of tea and a small book open in her lap. She looked up when she heard him coming. Whatever she thought about seeing him there at that hour, she kept it where he couldn't read it. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He held out the coffee cup. "I wasn't sure if you'd already eaten." She looked at the cup, then at him. A careful measuring look. "You brought me coffee," she said. "I asked the kitchen," he said. "I should have known how you take it. I don't know how you take it." "You didn't think to ask." "No, I didn't." He kept the cup extended. "I'm asking now." Indirectly. Something moved across her face, too quick to catch, too specific to name. She took the cup. "Warm with a small amount of cream," she said. "No sugar." "They told me cream, no sugar." "Then they know me better than you do." "Yes," he said. "That seems to be the situation with everyone on this property." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring again the way she always did. Then, almost imperceptibly, her expression shifted. Not softness exactly, but something slightly less guarded. Something that was considering the possibility of slightly less guarded. "Sit down, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "If you like." He sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a proper distance between them, and they sat in the garden in the thick summer heat as the sun came up over the east fence. And for the first time in 12 months, neither of them was alone in quite the same way they had been. It was not a resolution. Abigail knew that. One morning, and one cup of coffee, and one overheard prayer did not constitute a marriage. She had meant what she said in the morning room. Shame was not the same as love. And she was not in the business of accepting performances of contrition in place of the real and sustained and costly work of change. But she was a practical woman, and she was also somewhere under the practicality, in the part of herself she guarded most carefully, a woman who had not yet stopped hoping. She drank her coffee. He sat beside her. The summer pressed in from every direction. And somewhere in the house, on Jonathan Whitaker's writing desk, a sealed letter to his brother waited for the morning post. The letter reached Thomas Whitaker in Philadelphia on a Wednesday. By Friday, Jonathan had a reply. He was standing in the front hall when Margaret handed it to him, and he recognized his brother's handwriting on the front, with the particular shock of a man who had spent 18 months telling himself he didn't care, and had apparently been wrong about that in a significant way. His hand, his good hand, was not entirely steady when he broke the seal. Thomas wrote the way he always had, direct, a little blunt, no preamble. "I have been waiting for this letter for a year and a half. I had begun to wonder if it would ever come. Abigail wrote to me in February and told me you were grieving the quarrel more than you let on. I told her I doubted it. She told me I was wrong. I am beginning to think she is right about most things. Right again. T." Jonathan read it twice. Then he folded it and held it for a long moment in the hallway of his house. Abigail had told Thomas he was grieving. Abigail had known he was grieving. Had known it, named it to his brother, advocated for reconciliation between two men she barely knew, and had done all of it without once mentioning it to Jonathan himself, without once using it as leverage, without once asking for acknowledgement in return. He went to find her. She was in the small study off the parlor, the one she'd apparently claimed as her own workroom sometime in the fall, writing at the desk with the focused efficiency of someone working through a list. She looked up when he came in, her pen still in her hand. "Thomas wrote back," he said. "I know," she said. "He wrote to me as well." "What did he say to you?" "He said he was glad." She set down her pen. "He also said you were a proud, difficult man who needed approximately twice as long as anyone else to arrive at conclusions that were obvious to the rest of the room." He said it affectionately. "That sounds like Thomas." "It does." Jonathan leaned against the doorframe with his brother's letter in his hand, and looked at his wife across the small distance of the room. She looked back at him without any particular expression. She was very good at that, at looking at him without giving him the satisfaction of knowing what she thought. It had annoyed him once. Now it made him feel that he had not yet earned the right to see past it, which was a different feeling entirely. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "In February, when you first wrote to him." "I tried 3 times, she said. "You were unavailable." "I know, you said that. What I mean is after, when I finally was available. Why didn't you?" "Because it stopped being about the letters." She folded her hands on the desk. "After a while, Mr. Whitaker, I realized that the letters were simply one example of a larger situation. That you were not unavailable to me specifically. You were unavailable to your own life, to your own house, to everything and everyone in it." She paused. "I didn't think telling you about the letters would fix the larger situation. So I kept writing to Thomas and waited to see if you would find your way back on your own. And if I hadn't..." She looked at him steadily. "I had begun to consider my options," she said. "I am not a woman who waits forever." The room was very quiet for a moment. "I believe you," Jonathan said. "Good," said Abigail. "Sit down, Mr. Whitaker. There are some things I think we should discuss." He sat. She talked. She talked for the better part of an hour, and Jonathan listened in a way he had not listened to another person since before the war, not waiting for a pause so he could speak, but actually taking in what she was saying and letting it rearrange the furniture of his understanding. She told him about the estate accounts, which she had quietly organized, after discovering in September that the ledger was 6 months out of date and 2 of the tenant farmers had not been paid their fair percentage since the previous spring. She had corrected the ledgers herself and arranged payment without saying a word about it because she hadn't been asked to handle the accounts and didn't want to overstep. And now she was telling him because overstep or not, he needed to know. "You fixed my accounts," Jonathan said. "I corrected some errors," she said. "There is a difference." "Abigail, there are also 3 deferred repairs to the south barn that should be addressed before autumn," she said, moving forward, as though he hadn't spoken with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been carrying a list alone for a long time and is relieved to finally be able to put it down somewhere. "And Margaret's wages have not been increased in 4 years, which I consider a significant oversight given what she manages in this house." "I'll address it. I know you will. I'm telling you so that you understand the scope of what has been happening here while you were..." She searched for the word elsewhere. "Grieving," he said, because Thomas's word was in the end the accurate one. "Yes," she said more gently. "Grieving." The quiet between them shifted, became something different, less careful, more honest. "I didn't know," Jonathan said. "That any of it, the accounts, the barn, Margaret's wages, I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," she said. "That is precisely the problem. I should have known. You should have." She was not unkind about it. She was simply honest. "You should have known your own house, your own people, your own affairs. But you were not well." Jonathan and unwell men often cannot see past the edges of their own suffering. It was the first time she had used his given name since the wedding, and they both registered it, a small thing, but a shift, like a door opening half an inch. "I am not angry with you for being unwell. I am only telling you what was here waiting while you were away in your own mind. You kept it all together," he said. "Someone had to. Why did it have to be you? You could have let it fall apart. You had no reason to." "This is my home," she said with a simplicity that stopped him cold. "I live here. It may not have been chosen freely, and it may not have started as I might have wished, but this is the house I live in, and these are the people I live among, and I am not the kind of woman who lets things fall apart simply because no one has asked her to hold them together." Jonathan looked at his wife across the study, at this woman he had shared a name and a house and a dining table with for 12 months and had somehow failed to see, and felt something shift in the center of his chest. Not guilt this time, not shame. Something older and quieter. something that, if he was honest, felt a great deal like the early edges of awe. "Abigail," he said, "I owe you considerably more than an apology." "Yes," she said. "You do. But we can discuss the full accounting later." She folded her hands again and met his eyes, and for the first time there was something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Something that was not quite guarded, not quite open, but standing carefully at the door between the two. "Right now, there is something else I need to tell you. Something I should have told you months ago, and did not, because I was not sure it was my place." "Tell me." She was quiet for just a moment, choosing her words. "My cousin Silas has been writing to me," she said, "since March." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Silas Mercer was not a man Jonathan had spent much time thinking about. He was Abigail's cousin, her late father's nephew, a man of middling means and significant charm, who had appeared at the wedding long enough to congratulate Jonathan with a handshake that lasted slightly too long. Jonathan had filed him away in the category of people who were pleasant in a way that required no further attention, and that had been the end of it. "What does Silas want?" he said. Abigail opened the desk drawer and removed a small bundle of letters tied with twine, which she set on the desk between them. Jonathan looked at the letters, then at her. "How many?" "11, she said. "Since March. He's written you 11 times. He has written to remind me," she said with a precision that told him she had rehearsed this, "that the Mercer family's debts did not disappear when I married. He has written to remind me that my mother and my younger sisters still rely on the Mercer name, and that the Mercer name will only hold its creditors at bay for so long without financial support. He has written to suggest that as the wife of a man with resources, it would be my duty to my family, to my father's memory, to the name I was born with, to provide that support." The silence in the room was very loud. "How much has he asked for?" Jonathan said. "He hasn't asked," she said, in a tone that made it clear she understood precisely the distinction Silas was making. "He has written about need. He has written about family loyalty and duty and obligation. He has allowed me to draw my own conclusions." "And have you drawn conclusions?" She held his gaze. "I have been sending a portion of my household allowance to my mother since October," she said. "And in the spring, when the pressure from Silas became more direct, I sent an additional amount to satisfy what he called an urgent family debt. I believed at the time that it was the right thing to do. I believe now that I was not given all of the information I needed to make that decision clearly." "How much?" Jonathan said. His voice had gone very quiet. She told him. The number was not enormous. It was, however, considerably more than a woman's household allowance should have been able to cover, which told Jonathan exactly what kind of discipline and sacrifice had been operating behind the closed door of his wife's room for the past several months. "You went without," he said. "I managed." "Abigail, you went without, in your own household, while Silas Mercer—" "Jonathan!" Her voice was level but firm. "Before you decide what you are going to do about this, I need you to hear me very clearly." He stopped, looked at her. "I am telling you this," she said, "because you are my husband, and it is your money, and you have a right to know where it has gone. I am not telling you this so that you can ride to Richmond and have words with Silas and feel that you have defended my honor and then go back to your study and consider the matter closed. That's not what I—" "It is exactly what you are considering," she said not unkindly. "I can see it on your face. You want to fix it. Quickly. Because you feel guilty, and fixing it quickly would feel like accountability." She leaned forward slightly. "It is not accountability, Jonathan. It is a performance of accountability. And I have had 12 months of your absence, and I will not trade it for 12 months of rescue that is really just a different way of being managed." Jonathan breathed out slowly. "What do you want?" he said. "Tell me what you actually want." "I want my mother brought somewhere safe where Silas cannot use her as leverage against me," she said. "I want the estate's finances handled in a way that does not leave me relying on a household allowance that was never adequate for what was being asked of it. "And I want," she said, and for the first time her voice moved very slightly, very controlled, but moved. "I want to be consulted, Jonathan. Not managed, not protected after the fact. Consulted, before the fact. I can do those things," he said. "I know you believe that," she said. "The question is, whether you will still believe it in 6 months. What would it take for you to trust that I mean it?" She looked at him for a long time, really looked at him, not measuring this time, not assessing, but something more naked and more vulnerable underneath the kind of look a woman gives when she's trying very hard to decide whether the thing she hopes for is still worth hoping for. "Time," she said finally, "and consistency, and the understanding that I am not waiting to be won. I am waiting to be known." He did not go to Richmond that week. He wanted to. He sat with the wanting and made himself hold still because she was right. The impulse was guilt looking for a shortcut, and he had already taken too many shortcuts in this marriage to afford another one. Instead, he did something that was harder. He talked to her. Every morning that week he came down to breakfast and stayed at the table after the meal was finished and asked her questions. Not about the estate, not about the accounts, not about Silas. About her, where she had grown up, what her father had been like before the debts made him a smaller man, whether she had wanted anything for herself before the arrangement with Jonathan's family had made the question irrelevant. She answered with this careful honesty of a woman who had been asked for nothing for so long that she was slightly suspicious of being asked for something. But she answered. She told him her father had been funny privately, quick with a joke, easy with a laugh, the kind of man who became formal in public because he was afraid of not being taken seriously, but who told terrible puns at the supper table when it was only family. She told him she had wanted to travel, not anywhere particular, just farther than she had gone, which was not far. She told him she had read everything in her father's library twice over, and had been hoping when she came to the Whitaker estate that the library here might offer something new. "Have you looked at the library?" Jonathan said. "I did not feel I had permission," she said with a directness that made him flinch. "It's your house," he said. "Every room in it is yours." "You did not make that clear." "I'm making it clear now." "Yes," she said. "Now." He took her to the library that afternoon. It was a large room, better stocked than he remembered. His father had been a reader, and so had his mother. And Jonathan himself had once spent a considerable amount of time there before the war had made concentration into something that required more effort than it was worth. Abigail walked into the room and stopped. She turned in a slow half circle, looking at the shelves, and her face did something he hadn't seen before. Something unguarded. Something that looked like pure, uncomplicated pleasure. "Oh," she said. "Just that." "Oh." Jonathan stood in this doorway and watched his wife discover his library, and felt something in his chest pull toward her with a certainty that was almost alarming. It was not a dramatic thing. It was quiet and sudden and very sure of itself. The way hunger announces itself not loudly, but unmistakably. He thought, "I have wasted a year." Then he thought, "Don't waste the next one." The letter from Silas arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed this time not to Abigail. It was addressed to Jonathan. Margaret brought it to him in the study, and he opened it without any particular premonition, and read it once, and then set it very carefully on the desk, and breathed through his nose for a moment, before reading it again. Silas wrote with the practiced smoothness of a man who had spent a lifetime saying unpleasant things in pleasant language. He wrote to congratulate Jonathan on his marriage somewhat belatedly. He wrote about the Mercer family's esteem for the Whitaker name. He wrote about his dear cousin Abigail, who had always been such a devoted daughter, such a loyal sister, such a credit to the family that had raised her. And then he wrote still pleasantly, still smoothly, in the register of a man making a perfectly reasonable request between gentlemen that he would be in the Virginia region in the coming weeks, and that he hoped Jonathan would not object to a brief visit, as there were certain matters of mutual interest pertaining to the Mercer family finances and Abigail's ongoing obligations thereto that he felt would be better discussed in person. Abigail's ongoing obligations, Jonathan read those 3 words a third time. Then he went to find his wife. She was in the garden, the south wall, where she had apparently made peace with the roses on a level he had not yet managed. She saw his face when he came through the gate, and her own face changed immediately, the composure going carefully neutral in the way it did when she was bracing for something. "What happened?" she said. He held out the letter. She read it. The garden was very quiet. A bird somewhere in the orchard was repeating itself. The heat pressed down flat and heavy from a white sky. When she looked up, her expression was something he hadn't seen before, not fear exactly, but the particular controlled steadiness of a woman who has been afraid before and has learned to function through it. "He's escalating," she said. "Apparently. He's written to you because he believes I'm the easier target," she said. "Writing to you directly is a change of strategy. It means the money I sent wasn't enough, and he's decided to apply pressure through the husband rather than the wife." "He's not going to get anything from me," Jonathan said. "I know that," she said. "But Jonathan—" She paused, looking at him with that measuring look, and then she made a visible decision to say the next thing plainly. "He knows things. About my family. About my father's debts, the specific amounts, the specific creditors. If he chooses to spread that information in Richmond society, it would not ruin us, but it would complicate our position considerably. And he knows that." "Is that a threat?" "It's a tool," she said. "Silas doesn't make threats. He creates situations in which the threatened party arrives at conclusions independently." She folded the letter and handed it back to him. "He is very good at it. I have watched him do it my entire life." Jonathan looked at his wife, at the careful, contained way she was holding herself, at the slight tension in her jaw that told him she was more frightened than she was allowing her voice to show, and felt something sharpen inside him. Not the reflexive rescue impulse she had warned him against. Something quieter, colder, more purposeful. "Tell me everything you know about him," he said. "Every debt he's claimed, every letter he's sent, every conversation you've had." "Jonathan, not so I can go to Richmond," he said. "So that I understand what we are dealing with. Together." The word landed between them. Together. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face softened, not much, not dramatically, but enough. A degree of the guard she always kept coming down by a fraction. Like a door opening just slightly more than half an inch. "All right," she said. "And Abigail?" She looked at him. "I want your mother here," he said. "Before Silas arrives. I want her on the estate where Silas cannot use her as a point of pressure. Not as a rescue, as a practical measure. Your family is my family, and I should have made that clear a year ago." She stared at him. Her chin lifted very slightly. He had the feeling she was doing something she very rarely did in front of other people, which was trying not to let the emotion show on her face, and not entirely succeeding. "That is—" she started, stopped. "Thank you," she said finally. "That would mean a great deal to my mother." "Write to her today," he said. "I'll arrange the carriage." She nodded. She looked down at the rose she was still holding in her left hand. Then she looked back up at him with those dark, steady eyes, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there before. Something tentative and cautious and fragile, the way new growth looks before it's sure of the ground. "Do not rescue me today, only to forget me tomorrow," she said. It was not a warning this time. It was something closer to a plea. "I cannot—" her voice dropped slightly. "I cannot survive another year of that, Jonathan." He held her gaze. He held it long enough that she would know he was not looking away from it. "I know," he said. "I'm not going to forget you again. I understand that I have to prove that to you, and I understand that one morning and one letter to Thomas and one conversation about Silas does not prove it. I understand that I am starting from a significant deficit, and that you have every right to be skeptical, and that I am going to have to show you rather than tell you." He paused. "But I'm telling you anyway," he said. "Because you should hear it. Because you have been owed it for a year." Abigail looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "There are 11 letters in my desk. You should read all of them tonight. Not just the ones from Silas. The ones from Thomas, too. so you understand the full picture. I will. And Jonathan, she said, and her voice was very quiet now, pitched for the two of them and no one else. For what it is worth, whatever you heard 2 nights ago through my door, you don't need to. I meant it, she said. All of it. The garden held the moment between them, the heat, the white sky, the half-wild roses, and 2 people standing at the first real border of an understanding that was going to take much longer to build than it had taken to destroy. Jonathan took a breath. I know, he said. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. She turned back to the roses. He went inside. And somewhere in the streets of Richmond, Silas Mercer was already composing the lie that would change everything. Silas Mercer arrived on a Tuesday, which Jonathan thought was fitting. Tuesday was the dullest day of the week, and Silas was the kind of man who dressed his intentions in the dullest possible clothing, so nobody looked too closely at what was underneath. He rode up to the house in a good coat and a hired horse and smiled at Jonathan with all of his teeth. And Jonathan, who had spent the past 2 weeks reading 11 letters and learning the precise shape of how this man operated, smiled back with equal warmth and none of the same sincerity. Whitaker, Silas said, stepping down from the saddle with the easy confidence of a man who assumed all doors would open for him. Good of you to receive me. Of course, Jonathan said. Come in. Abigail was waiting in the front parlor. She had dressed carefully, not elaborately, not in a way that performed anything, but with the particular precision of a woman who understands that how she presents herself in a room is itself a form of speech. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded. Her face was composed in a way that Jonathan now recognized as the expression she wore when she was working very hard not to show what she was actually feeling. Silas crossed the room and took her hand and bent over it with an excess of affection that made Jonathan's jaw tighten. Dear cousin, Silas said, you look well. Marriage agrees with you. Silas, Abigail said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. How was the journey? Long, he said, but worth it to see family. He turned and looked around the parlor with the unhurried appraisal of a man calculating the value of everything in the room. What a fine house. You've done well for yourself, Abigail. We've done well, she said with a slight emphasis on the first word that Silas either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Jonathan noticed. They sat. And Silas began in his pleasant, unhurried way to dismantle the afternoon. He did not make demands. He never made demands. Abigail had warned Jonathan about this with considerable precision. Silas made observations. He observed that the Mercer family's situation in Richmond had become rather delicate. He observed that Abigail's mother was a woman of refinement, who deserved better than the reduced circumstances she currently occupied. He observed that certain debts which bore the Mercer name had attracted the attention of creditors who were becoming, shall we say, less patient than they had been. He observed all of this while looking pleasantly between Jonathan and Abigail, as though they were all simply having a family conversation about a family difficulty, as though there was nothing in the room except goodwill and kinship. What I'm suggesting, Silas said, arriving at last at the point after 20 minutes of careful approach, is that some arrangement might be made, informally, between family. A modest and ongoing contribution routed through me, which would stabilize the situation considerably and reflect well on the Whitaker name's generosity toward— No, Jonathan said. Silas stopped. Silas. The word had come out clean and flat, and without any particular anger, which was, Jonathan had found, the most effective way to say it. Silas blinked, recalibrated, smiled again. I understand there may be questions about the specific. I said no, Jonathan said. There will be no informal arrangement routed through you. If Abigail's mother requires support, she will receive it directly without your involvement because she will be living near this estate within the month and will have no further need of a middleman. The smile on Silas's face did not disappear. It changed, became something thinner. That's quite a decision to make without consulting the family, he said. Abigail is my family, Jonathan said. Her mother is my family, You." He paused just long enough. "Are a guest? And guests do not arrange the finances of the houses they visit." The silence in the parlor was absolute. Abigail did not move. But Jonathan, who had been learning to read her, saw something happen behind her eyes, something fast and hot and fiercely controlled. Not quite relief. Something bigger than relief. Something that looked like a woman hearing a door open that she had given up on. Silas set down his cup. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, I imagine we understand each other then." "Perfectly," Jonathan said. Silas left before supper. Jonathan stood on the front steps and watched him ride down the drive, and something at the back of his mind, the part that had learned in the war to pay attention to the things that walked away too quietly, said, "This is not finished." It was not finished. The rumor reached Jonathan through Thomas, who wrote from Philadelphia in a letter that arrived 4 days after Silas's departure, and who was clearly angrier than he usually allowed himself to appear on paper. "There is talk in Richmond," Thomas wrote. "Silas Mercer has been telling people that Abigail came to the marriage with a letter ostensibly from Mother, endorsing the match, encouraging you to proceed. The claim being made is that the letter was forged. That Abigail produced it to secure the arrangement because her family was desperate. That you were deceived into the marriage by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had no scruples about how she did it. Jonathan, I do not know what Silas Mercer is to you, but I know what he is doing and I know why. He was refused and he is retaliating. You need to act before this takes hold." Jonathan read the letter standing in the front hall. Then he walked to the parlor and read it again. Then he went to find Abigail. She was in the library. She spent most of her mornings in the library now, and the sight of her there surrounded by his mother's books and his father's books had stopped being strange and started being the most natural thing in the world, and she was reading, but she set the book down the moment she saw his face. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He watched the color leave her face. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic woman. It went quietly the way warmth leaves a room when a window opens in winter. Her hands folded in her lap, went very still. "A forged letter," she said, "from my mother." "He is saying I forged a letter from your dead mother." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "He chose that specifically," she said, not to Jonathan, but working it out. "Because it is impossible to disprove. Your mother cannot confirm or deny it. Any letter she actually wrote can be called into question. Any letter she didn't write can be claimed to exist." Her voice was very controlled. "It is elegant as lies go. I'll give him that." "We'll go to Richmond," Jonathan said. "Together. We'll address it directly, make a statement." "No." She said it quietly, but with a finality that stopped him. "Abigail." "Jonathan, if you go to Richmond and make a statement defending me, you are a husband defending his wife. It will be noted. It will be appreciated. And in 6 months, when people remember the story, what they will remember is that there was a story, and that Jonathan Whittaker had to defend his wife, which means there was something to defend against." She looked at him steadily. "I will not have my reputation salvaged by my husband. I will not spend the rest of my life in Richmond society as the woman whose husband had to rescue her." "Then what do we do?" "There is a winter assembly," she said. "The Harrington Gathering, last week of August." "That's in 3 weeks." "Yes." Her chin lifted. That small particular lift that he was learning meant she had already made a decision and was now informing him of it. "Every family of consequence in Richmond will be there. Silas will be there because Silas goes everywhere he believes he can work a room." She paused. "I would like to go." "To face him. To face the room," she said. "Silas is not the problem. The room is the problem. Silas only has power if the room believes him. I intend to address the room." Jonathan looked at her, at the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, the absolute absence of wavering, and thought of the woman he had imagined he was marrying a year ago. Quiet, he had thought. Manageable. Convenient. He had been so profoundly wrong. "All right," he said. "We go to the assembly." "I go to the assembly," she said. "You come with me. there is a difference. What's the difference? The difference is that when I walk into that room, I walk in as the mistress of the Whitaker estate on my own authority, making my own case. Not as a wife being escorted by her husband because she needs his support to stand upright. She held his gaze. I need you there, but I need you behind me, not in front of me. Can you do that? Jonathan breathed out slowly. He reflected, a harder thing to agree to than it sounded. Yes, he said. I can do that. The 3 weeks before the assembly were the strangest and most honest 3 weeks of Jonathan Whitaker's marriage. Abigail's mother, Eleanor Mercer, arrived at the estate on a Thursday, in a hired coach with 2 trunks, and the particular dignity of a woman who had been through considerable difficulty and had decided that difficulty was not going to defeat her bearing. She was 61, small, fine-boned, with Abigail's eyes and a sharpness in her expression that told Jonathan immediately where her daughter had learned to read a room. She shook Jonathan's hand at the door and said, "You have a fine property, Mr. Whitaker. I hope you deserve it." Jonathan said, "I'm working on it, Mrs. Mercer." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Abigail has good judgment. That she has remained here this long tells me something." "I'm not sure it reflects well on my judgment," Jonathan said. "No," Eleanor said pleasantly. "It reflects well on hers." Abigail, standing slightly behind her mother, covered what might have been a smile with the back of her hand. Eleanor Mercer settled into the estate with the unhurried competence of a woman reclaiming solid ground. She and Abigail sat together in the mornings at the table in the east wing, and Jonathan could hear them talking from the hallway. Low voices, sometimes laughter, sometimes a long silence, that sounded like 2 people who had missed each other and were simply glad to be in the same room again. He did not intrude on those mornings. He understood instinctively that they were not his to intrude on. But he started appearing at supper. Every supper. He started asking Eleanor about her garden. She had apparently had a remarkable garden in Richmond before the debts made upkeep impossible, and she told him about it in the specific loving way people talk about things they have lost and might someday get back. He listened to all of it. He listened in the way that Abigail had taught him without waiting for his turn to speak. On the second Sunday evening, Eleanor looked across the table at Jonathan and said quite without preamble, "Silas has always been threatened by Abigail's competence, since they were children. He is charming where she is steady, and the world often prefers charm, but charm requires an audience and steadiness does not. He has never forgiven her for not needing an audience." Jonathan glanced at Abigail, who was looking at her mother with an expression that suggested this was not a topic they had previously discussed in those terms. "I know," Jonathan said. "I understand him better now than I did." "Do you understand her?" Eleanor said. "I'm beginning to," he said. "I should have begun sooner." Eleanor considered this. Then she picked up her fork and said, "Well, you've begun. That is something," in a tone that made it absolutely clear that beginning was the minimum, and she was watching to see what came after. The letter arrived a week before the assembly, not from Thomas this time, not from Silas, from a woman named Mrs. Catherine Harrington, whose husband organized the assembly and whose social influence in Richmond operated on a level that most politicians would have found impressive. The letter was addressed to Jonathan. It said with great courtesy and considerably clear intention that she had heard certain troubling reports regarding the Whitaker marriage, and that given the sensitivity of the situation, she wanted Jonathan to know that she remained warmly disposed toward the Whitaker family, and that should he and his wife choose to attend the assembly, they would of course be received, though she wanted him to be prepared for the fact that the conversation in certain quarters had grown rather pointed. She ended the letter by expressing her sincere hope that the matter would resolve itself satisfactorily. Jonathan read it once and put it in his desk drawer. Then he went to find Abigail, who was in the garden with her mother, and he handed her the letter without a word. She read it. Eleanor read it over her shoulder. "She's giving us a warning," Abigail said. "She's giving us an out," Jonathan said. "She's telling us we don't have to come." "She is telling you that you don't have to come," Abigail said, handing the letter back. She is telling you that if you want to spare yourself the discomfort of watching your wife be gossiped about in public, she will understand. I'm not interested in sparing myself. Good, Eleanor said from beside her daughter with exactly the same brisk certainty Abigail used when she had made up her mind. Then we go. They arrived at the Harrington house on a Saturday evening. Abigail wore a deep red gown. She had made the choice deliberately, and told Jonathan so when he saw her in the front hall before they left. Red was not a color for a woman trying to disappear, and she was not trying to disappear. She was 30 seconds from walking into a room full of people who had spent 3 weeks discussing whether she was a liar, and she intended to walk in as though the discussion was beneath her notice while being completely aware that it was not. "You look," Jonathan said, and then stopped because the word that came to mind first was formidable, and he wasn't sure she'd take it the right way. "I know," she said, pulling on her gloves. "Let's go." The room, when they entered it, went through a very specific sequence of reactions that Jonathan tracked with the cold attention of a man who had learned to read a battlefield. First, awareness. The room knew they had arrived within seconds of their arrival. Second, assessment. Eyes moved to Abigail, moved away, moved back. Third, the shift. Conversations which had been moving freely began to move more carefully. Groups which had been open began to angle slightly inward. Abigail felt all of it. Jonathan, walking a half-step behind and to her right as they had agreed, watched her feel. It watched her chin lift and her shoulders settle, and her expression arrange itself into something that was not defiance and not submission, but something precisely between the two. The specific expression of a woman who has decided that the room's opinion of her is a matter she intends to address on her own schedule. Mrs. Harrington received them near the entrance with a warmth that was genuine enough to be useful and careful enough to be diplomatic. "Mrs. Whittaker," she said, "what a remarkable gown." "Thank you," Abigail said. "You have a beautiful home, Catherine." First name, clean, confident. The room heard it. They moved through. Silas found them 40 minutes later. Jonathan saw him coming before Abigail did a man moving through a crowd with the particular relaxed trajectory of someone who has selected his target and is in no hurry because he is confident in his position. He was smiling. He was always smiling. "Abigail," he said, stopping before them with an expression of apparently genuine pleasure. "What a surprise! I didn't expect to see you here." "I imagine not," she said. "And Jonathan." The smile extended to include him. "Good of you both to come. It takes courage, doesn't it, when there's been—" He paused just briefly for exactly as long as necessary. "Talk." "There's always talk," Jonathan said. "Talk is what people produce when they don't have anything more useful to do with their time." Silas's smile didn't waver. "Of course. Though some talk carries more weight than others, particularly when it concerns, shall we say, the circumstances of a marriage." His eyes moved to Abigail. "I do hope you understand, cousin, that whatever has been said has not come from any desire to harm. It has come from concern about the manner in which certain documents may have been represented to Jonathan's family." The people nearest to them had stopped pretending not to listen. Abigail looked at Silas for a moment. A long, steady, entirely unhurried moment. Then she said, "Silas, let us not do this dance." He blinked. "You have told people that I forged a letter from Catherine Whittaker endorsing this marriage," she said. Her voice was clear and perfectly controlled and pitched at exactly the volume necessary for the nearest dozen people to hear every word. "You have done this because Jonathan refused your request for money, and you required a consequence to impose. I understand the logic. It's actually quite good strategy as far as it goes." Silas was no longer smiling. "I don't know what you sent 11 letters between March and July," she said. "I have them all. I have the amounts you specified. I have the language you used, family duty obligation, loyalty to the Mercer name. I have the letter you sent to Jonathan in August, suggesting a mutual arrangement, and I have the timeline of events, which makes it perfectly clear that the rumor about the forged letter appeared in Richmond within 1 week of that arrangement being refused." She tilted her head slightly. "Shall I continue? Because I have quite a bit more and the room seems interested." The room was absolutely, entirely, breathlessly interested. Silas opened his mouth. "The money you told me was for family debts," Abigail said before he could speak. "I have since made inquiries. My mother confirmed that she received a fraction of what I sent. The remainder went to a debt of yours, Silas. Not a family debt. Your debt. Taken in your own name from a creditor in Philadelphia who apparently has a very specific memory of the transaction." Something happened to Silas's face. The pleasantness cracked just slightly, just at the edges, and underneath it was something much less carefully managed. "You cannot prove—" "I have a letter from Thomas Whitaker," she said, "who was kind enough to make the inquiry in Philadelphia on my behalf. Thomas is very thorough." She glanced once at Jonathan just briefly. "It runs in the family, apparently." The crack in Silas's expression widened, and then Jonathan stepped forward, not in front of Abigail, beside her. One step forward, and one step to the left, so that he was shoulder to shoulder with his wife, facing the room that had spent 3 weeks discussing her, and the room saw it, felt it, the way a room feels when the balance of weight in it shifts. "My wife has addressed the matter clearly," Jonathan said. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. "I'll add only this. Abigail Mercer came to this house with more integrity than it deserved. She has managed this estate, kept my accounts restored. My mother's orchard brokered a reconciliation with my brother, and cared for people under this roof who were not her responsibility by any measure except her own character. She did all of this without recognition, without complaint, and without leverage." He looked at Silas directly. "The man who invented a lie to destroy that reputation because she would not allow herself to be used, that man is not worth the room's time, and I think most of you know it." The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Mrs. Harrington, standing 8 feet away with a glass of wine in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this, said clearly, "Well said, Mr. Whitaker," and the room turned away from Silas Mercer. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of decision. It happened the way a tide moves gradually, and then all at once, as people who had been watching carefully now turned back to their conversations, turned their shoulders, withdrew their attention. The room had made its judgment, and Silas was on the wrong side of it, and the room was done with him. Silas stood in the middle of it and understood that he had lost. He left 20 minutes later. Jonathan watched him go from across the room and did not follow and did not feel the need to. Abigail was beside him. She had a glass of wine in her hand that she had barely touched. She was looking at the room with an expression that was tired and steady, in equal measure, the expression of a woman who had done a hard thing and done it well, and was now allowing herself to feel how hard it had been. "Are you all right?" Jonathan said. "I will be," she said. "Abigail." He kept his voice low. "For her, not for the room. What you did just now was necessary," she said. "It was remarkable." She looked at him, and something in her face, underneath the composure, underneath the steadiness in that guarded place, she kept most carefully moved. A tremor, small, real. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "You didn't show it." "No," she said. "But I was." They stood side by side in the Harrington parlor in the middle of a room that had just watched Abigail Whitaker dismantle a lie with her own bare hands. And Jonathan looked at his wife, really looked at her, and felt something move through him that was too big for the word proud, and too specific for the word love, and too urgent for anything he knew how to say out loud. So he didn't say it. He reached across the small distance between them and offered her his arm, his right arm, the one that hurt, the one he rarely offered to anyone, and waited. Abigail looked at his arm, then at his face. Then she took it. And they walked back into the room together, and they stayed until the end of the evening, and not a single person in that room mentioned a forged letter for the rest of the night. They did not speak much on the ride home. The carriage moved through the dark Virginia roads, with the lantern swaying at the front, and Jonathan sat across from Abigail and watched her in the unsteady light, and let the silence be what it was. Not uncomfortable, not distant, but the particular quiet of two people who have just been through something together and have not yet decided what to do with the fact that they survived it. Eleanor had stayed the evening at the Harrington house at Catherine Harrington's invitation, which meant it was only the two of them in the carriage, which was itself a thing that had never quite happened before. They had ridden together to Sunday church, and once to a neighbor's dinner in the spring, but always with the careful formality of two people performing the role of a married couple. This was different. This was Jonathan noticing that Abigail had taken off her gloves and was turning them over and over in her hands, the way she did when she was processing something she hadn't finished processing yet. "You're still thinking about it," he said. "I'm always still thinking about it," she said. "I'll be thinking about it for a week." "About Silas or about the room?" "About myself," she said. "About whether I handled it correctly. Whether there was a way to do it that caused less." She paused, searching spectacle. "There wasn't," he said. "Not with Silas. He had already chosen spectacle. You just chose to be the one who controlled it." She looked at him. "You saw it that way. I saw you walk into a room that was ready to believe the worst about you and make it reconsider entirely on your own terms," he said, "without asking anyone for help, without flinching once." He held her gaze. "It was the bravest thing I've seen since the war. And I mean that without any qualification." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. The lantern light moved across her face, and he could see the tiredness in her more clearly now that the evening was behind them. The deep, specific tiredness of a person who has been holding themselves very tightly for several hours and is only now beginning to let the tension go. "Jonathan?" she said. "Yes." "Thank you. For stepping forward when you did. For not stepping in front of me." "You told me not to." "Other men would have done it anyway," she said. "Because it would have felt better, easier, more natural." She looked at her hands. "You didn't. And it mattered." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm learning." "I know," she said. "I know you are." The carriage rolled on through the dark. Ooh. He came to her the following morning, not with coffee this time, not with an estate matter or a letter from Thomas, or a practical reason that gave him an excuse to cross the threshold of whatever distance was still between them. He came with nothing except himself, which was harder, and knocked on the door of her sitting room and waited. She opened it. She was in her plain morning dress, her hair not yet fully arranged, and she looked at him with those steady eyes that had stopped being unreadable to him. He was beginning slowly to learn the language of her face, the way you learn a language you should have studied years ago and are now approaching with the urgency of a man who understands what he missed. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair near the window, the one she never used because she always sat at the desk, and she sat at the desk and looked at him with an expression that was carefully neutral, but not closed. Not the armor she used to wear, but something more considered than openness. "I have something to say," he said. "I want to say it plainly without making it into a speech, because you have told me very clearly that you can tell the difference between something real and something performed. So I am going to say it simply, and trust that you'll hear it the way it's meant." "All right," she said. "I love you," he said. The room was very still. "I don't know exactly when it happened," he said. "I don't think it happened at one moment. I think it happened the way most real things happen, gradually and then suddenly, and then you look up and realize it's been true for a while, and you just weren't paying attention." He kept his eyes on her face. "I love you. Not because of last night. Not because of the accounts or the orchard or the letters to Thomas. Not because I feel guilty, though I do. Because you are the most genuinely good person I have shared a room with in my entire life, and I wasted a year of it, and I am not willing to waste another day." Abigail was very quiet. She was not looking at him with the expression he had half expected, not softening, not relief, not the particular yielding that a woman in a romantic story displays when the man she has been waiting for finally arrives. She was looking at him with something more complicated and more honest than that. Something that had hope in it and pain in it in equal measure, sitting right next to each other, the way they do when a person has wanted something for a long time and is not sure they trust themselves to want it anymore. "Jonathan," she said, "I know what you're going to say." "I don't think you do." "You're going to tell me that a confession of love after a public victory feels like the wrong order," he said. "That it's too connected to last night to be trusted as its own separate thing. That shame and gratitude and relief can feel like love when they're strong enough, and that you have already been fooled once by the idea of this marriage, and you are not interested in being fooled again." She looked at him. "Am I wrong?" he said. "You're not entirely wrong," she said carefully. "But that is not what I was going to say." "Then tell me." She folded her hands on the desk. She took a breath, slow and deliberate, the way she did when she was choosing her words very specifically. "I have already lived 1 year in this house as your wife out of duty," she said. 1 year of taking care of everything that needed taking care of learning your habits, and managing your household, and writing to your brother, and praying for your hand and your sleep and your grief out of duty, and out of—" She paused. "Out of hope. A hope I was not sure was sensible." She met his eyes. "I will not live the rest of my life on duty alone, Jonathan. I will not live it on hope alone. And I will not live it on a declaration made the morning after a difficult evening, when emotions are still very close to the surface." "Then what will you live it on?" he said. "Evidence," she said. "The daily kind." He breathed out slowly. "Tell me what that looks like," he said. "Specifically, tell me what you need." She told him. She told him with the directness he was learning to expect from her, and had come to rely on in a way he hadn't anticipated. This quality she had of simply saying the true thing, plainly, without dressing it up or softening it for his comfort. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who softened things for him, and he had not known until Abigail what it cost him. How much he had missed, how many real conversations he had lost to comfortable approximations. She told him she needed him to choose her when nothing was at stake, not when Silas was threatening, not when the room was watching, not when his guilt was sharp and immediate, but on the ordinary Tuesday mornings, when there was no particular reason to choose her, except that she was his wife, and his home, and his person. She told him she needed to manage the estate openly, not in secret, not as a courtesy, with genuine authority, with her name on the decisions, with the staff understanding that she spoke with the same weight he did. She told him she needed her mother to stay, not as a guest, as family. She told him she needed him to continue with Thomas, not one letter, not a reconciliation moment, but real and sustained correspondence, the kind that admitted fault, and received it, and kept going anyway. And then she told him the last thing, which was the one she said most quietly. "I need you to be present," she said. "Not perfect. I am not asking for perfect. I know you are a wounded man, and I know that healing is not a straight line. But I need you present, Jonathan. I need you to come down to breakfast and stay after the meal is done. I need you to ask me things, not about the estate, about me. And I need you to notice when I'm carrying something I haven't told you about, and ask me about that too." "The way you noticed with me," he said. "Yes," she said. "The way I noticed with you." The morning light came through the window behind her, and he could see her clearly, the tiredness still in her face, and underneath it, something more careful, something that was very close to the bone, the place where what a person actually feels lives when they have stopped protecting it quite so thoroughly. "Abigail," he said, "I accept every one of those conditions, freely and with the understanding that they are not conditions. They are what a marriage should have looked like from the beginning, and the fact that they require stating is my failure, not yours." She was quiet. "I also want to say something else," he said. "And I want you to know it is not a performance, because if it were a performance, I would have said it last night in the Harrington parlor when the room was watching. I am saying it now in this room with no audience." She waited. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the year, for the breakfast I ate without asking who arranged it, for the 3 times you came to my door in March and I was unavailable, for walking past your door 1,000 nights without once thinking to knock, for treating you as a transaction when you were a person." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not something with weight to it, The weight of a man who has looked at himself clearly and not liked what he found, and is not asking to be forgiven for the looking, only acknowledged for it. I am sorry. Not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because you deserved better, and I knew how to do better, and I chose not to. Abigail looked at him for a very long time. Then she said, I know. 2 words, but the way she said them, not dismissive, not forgiving, not closing the matter, but simply receiving it, letting it land where it was meant to land, told Jonathan that she had heard him, that she believed him, that she was not quite ready to say so in plain terms, but that the door between whatever she was guarding and wherever he was standing had just opened another inch. Give me time, she said. Not permission Jonathan time, there is a difference. I am not asking you to wait while I decide whether you are worth it. I am telling you that trust is not a decision I make once. It is something I rebuild in small pieces over time based on what I see, and I am willing to begin rebuilding it. That's all I'm asking, he said. No? She said with the ghost of something that was almost a smile. You asked for love. That is considerably more than what you're claiming to ask for. You're right, he said. I suppose I am. He started that same day. He did not make a speech about starting. He did not announce that he was implementing the conditions of Abigail's terms. He simply started. He went to Margaret and told her that Mrs. Whittaker was to be consulted on all estate matters that did not relate specifically to the Fields, which was most of them, and that her instructions carried the same authority as his. Margaret received this information with the expression of a woman who had been waiting 22 years for someone to say the obvious thing. Very good, Mr. Whittaker, she said, and went to find Abigail immediately. He wrote to Thomas that afternoon. Not a carefully composed letter, a direct one. He told Thomas everything that had happened at the Harrington Assembly, and about Silas and about what Abigail had done. He told Thomas that he intended to come to Philadelphia in October if Thomas would have him, that there were things he needed to say that letters couldn't carry. That he had been a proud, difficult man who had arrived at conclusions about 20 months too late, and that he was aware of the irony of Thomas having said the same thing first. Thomas wrote back in 6 days. The letter said, Come in October. Stay as long as you need. Bring Abigail. I want to meet the woman who apparently fixed everything I couldn't. Jonathan left the letter on Abigail's desk without comment. She found it that evening and read it, and when she came to supper she said, Your brother is funny. He gets it from our mother, Jonathan said. So do you, she said. When you let yourself. He looked at her across the table. I didn't know you thought that. You've never given me much opportunity to tell you what I think, she said. We are working on that. We are, he agreed. Eleanor Mercer, who was sitting at the end of the table enjoying her soup, with the serenity of a woman whose daughter was finally visibly in a situation that warranted hope, said nothing at all and smiled into her bowl. The twist nobody saw coming arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the assembly. Jonathan was in the study when Margaret brought him the news, and the news was this: a creditor from Richmond had appeared at the gate that morning asking to speak with Mr. Whittaker about a debt bearing the Whittaker name. Not the Mercer name, the Whittaker name. Jonathan went to the gate and spoke to the creditor, and came back to the study and sat down and read the document the man had left behind, and then he read it again. And then he understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man whose military experience had taught him to recognize an ambush after the fact, exactly what Silas Mercer had done. Before the assembly, before Jonathan had refused the arrangement, before any of this had started, Silas had borrowed money in Richmond using Jonathan's name as a guarantor. Not a large amount, not enough to be immediately ruinous, but enough to be real enough to be documented enough to constitute fraud, and enough, Jonathan realized, as he read the signatures at the bottom of the contract, to be something Silas had been holding in reserve, an insurance policy, a contingency for exactly the situation that had occurred: the refusal, the exposure, the social ruin. If Silas could not have the money, he intended to cost Jonathan it anyway. Jonathan sat with that document for a long time. Then he did something he would not have done 3 months ago. He went and found Abigail. She was in the library. She looked up from her book when he came in and read his face in the way she had learned to read his face quickly, accurately, without drama. "What happened?" she said. He told her. He put the document in her hands and let her read it, and watched her face go through the specific sequence of expressions that told him she was doing what she always did, not reacting immediately but thinking, assessing, finding the structure of the problem before deciding how to approach it. "He planned this before the assembly," she said. "Yes." "Which means he knew he might lose." He was covering himself. "He is more intelligent than I gave him credit for," she said, with the dispassionate fairness of a woman who can acknowledge competence in an enemy without conceding anything else. Then she set the document down. "Jonathan, I know someone." "What do you mean?" "A lawyer," she said, "in Richmond. He was a friend of my father's, one of the ones who stayed a friend after the debts. He knows contract law, and he knows Silas Mercer, and he has been waiting, I believe, for a reason to do something about that knowledge." She met his eyes. "This document has Silas's signature on it alongside yours, which means it also has evidence of Silas's intent, which means it is not only a problem, it is a tool." Jonathan looked at his wife. "You have been 2 steps ahead of this man since March," he said. "I grew up in the same house as his ambitions," she said. "You learned to see around corners." "Will you contact the lawyer?" "I already know what I'll say," she said. "I've known for months that something like this was coming. I just didn't know what shape it would take." "You prepared for it." "I prepared for contingencies," she said. "That is what I do." She picked up the document again. "Give me until tomorrow morning. I'll have a letter ready." Jonathan stood in the library doorway and looked at his wife. This woman who had been quietly preparing for his battles while he wasn't paying attention, who had seen the danger he'd missed, who had maps to terrains he hadn't known to scout, and felt a love so specific and so sure of itself that it was almost disorienting. "Abigail," he said. She looked up. "I need you to hear something," he said. "Not as a declaration, not as a performance, just as a fact." "Tell me." "This house is better because you are in it," he said. "I am better because you are in it. And whatever comes next with Silas, or with the estate, or with anything else, I want to face it standing beside you. Not protecting you, beside you." She held his gaze. The library was very still. "Beside me," she said, testing the word the way you test ice before you put your weight on it. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. And then she did something she had not done in 13 months of marriage, not once, not in any room he had ever seen her in. She let him see that she was moved. Not dramatically. Not with tears or with words. She simply let the composure come down for one unguarded moment, just one. And in that moment, her face was entirely real and entirely his to see. "All right," she said quietly. "Beside me then." And she turned back to the document, and Jonathan pulled the other chair to the desk, not his chair, not across the room, but right beside hers, and sat down. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. "Your signature on the letter," she said, "and your trust." "You have both." "I know," she said. And then she did something else she had not done before. Without looking up from the document, without making anything of it at all, she reached across the desk and put her hand briefly over his right hand, the one that hurt, the one that always hurt, and then she took it away and kept writing. Jonathan breathed. Outside, the summer was finally beginning to exhaust itself. The heat that had pressed down on Virginia since June was starting at last to think about giving way. The creek along the property line had come back. The roses on the south wall had finished their second bloom. The Whitaker estate looked the way it had not looked in several years, not just maintained, but tended, not just occupied, but lived in. There was a difference, and anyone who came through the gate could feel it. Eleanor Mercer felt it every morning when she came down to the kitchen to argue pleasantly with the cook about breakfast. Margaret felt it in the way the household moved with more confidence, more direction, more of the specific efficiency that comes when people know their instructions come from someone who understands what they are doing. Thomas felt it in the letters that now arrived every 2 weeks, Without fail. Letters that sounded like his brother again. Not the withdrawn, aching man who had come back from Baltimore, but the one who had been there before, the one who used to argue about books at supper, and lose badly, and not mind. And Jonathan felt it every morning when he came down to breakfast and stayed at the table after the meal was finished. And Abigail looked at him from across the table with something that was no longer measuring, no longer guarded, but still not entirely open. Something that was, he thought, exactly what trust looks like when it is being built, one brick at a time, by two people who have decided the structure is worth the labor. He was not going to rush it. He was not going to perform it. He was going to show up every morning and stay at the table and ask her real questions and listen to the answers, and he was going to sign his name next to hers on the letter to the lawyer in Richmond, and he was going to go to Philadelphia in October and look his brother in the eye and say the things that letters couldn't carry. And when the time came, not today, maybe not this month, maybe not until autumn had finished coming in, and the cold had settled properly, and they had been through enough of the ordinary days together that she could feel the consistency of him. When that time came, he thought she would tell him what she had never quite said, that she loved him too. He could wait. He had after all made her wait a year for considerably less. The least he could do was offer her the same patience she had never once been asked to offer him. The lawyer's name was Edmund Greer, and he had known Silas Mercer for 11 years, which was, he said, approximately 11 years longer than was good for anyone's peace of mind. He came to the Whitaker estate on a Thursday in early September, a small, precise man with a leather case under his arm, and the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. He sat across from Jonathan and Abigail at the dining room table. Abigail had insisted on being present, and Jonathan had said, of course, without hesitation, which Greer noted and did not comment on, and he opened his leather case and laid out documents with the careful deliberation of a man who had been arranging this particular hand for a long time and was pleased to finally play it. The fraudulent guarantor document was, Greer explained, not the first time Silas Mercer had used another person's name to secure credit in Richmond. There had been two previous instances, one in 1811, one in 1812, both of which had been quietly settled by families who preferred not to have the matter made public. Both of which Greer had documented. Both of which could now be combined with the current fraud to constitute a pattern of deliberate criminal deception. What are our options? Jonathan said. You could pursue criminal charges, Greer said. That is the most complete solution, but it is also the most public, and the Mercer name, he glanced at Abigail. The Mercer name is not my concern, Abigail said. My mother is my concern. My sisters are my concern. Silas has spent years using that name as though it belonged to him. It doesn't, Greer nodded. Then I would suggest a more targeted approach. I present Silas with a full accounting of what we have. I inform him that any further contact with either of you, financial or social, will result in those documents being submitted to the Richmond court. And I make clear that the debt he attached to your name, Mr. Whitaker, will be repaid by Silas himself in full within 90 days. Will he comply? Jonathan said. He will, Greer said. Silas is a man of calculation, not conviction. When the calculation changes, so does he. Do it, Abigail said. Jonathan looked at her. She was looking at Greer with the same clear, direct certainty she brought to everything. No drama, no hesitation, just the clean decision of a woman who had thought it through and arrived at the right answer. Do it, Jonathan confirmed. Greer left an hour later. Jonathan and Abigail sat at the dining table with the empty chairs around them, and the morning coming through the windows, and Abigail put both hands flat on the table and let out a long, slow breath. It was the most visibly relieved he had ever seen her. The relief moved through her like something physical, like a weight she had been carrying for months, finally being set on the floor. It's done, he said. Not yet, she said. 90 days. Abigail. She looked at him. It's done, he said again. Quiet, certain. She held his gaze. And then for the second time in as many weeks she let him see her without the armor. Not for long, but long enough. Yes, she said softly. I suppose it is. They went to Philadelphia in October. Thomas Whitaker was 38 years old and looked so much like Jonathan that Abigail stopped in the doorway of his front hall for half a second and simply stared, the same jaw, the same way of standing with his weight slightly forward, the same eyes, though Thomas's had more laughter in them and considerably less military damage. Thomas looked at her and said without any preamble at all, "You're the one who wrote to me in February." "I am," she said. "You told me my brother was grieving the quarrel more than he let on." "He was." "I told you I doubted it." "You did." Thomas glanced at Jonathan, who was standing slightly behind Abigail, with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and the particular sheepishness of a man being discussed accurately. Then Thomas looked back at Abigail. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for doubting you, and a significant debt for doing the thing neither of us were capable of doing ourselves." He extended his hand. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Whitaker. Properly this time." Abigail shook his hand. "She was already family," Jonathan said from behind her. "I was just the last one to understand it." Thomas looked at his brother with the expression of a man hearing something he had waited a long time to hear, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Come inside. I have things I need to say that require sitting down." They sat, and the two brothers talked. Abigail sat beside Jonathan and listened, and what she heard was not a performance of reconciliation, but the real and uncomfortable work of it. Two men who loved each other and had said things they couldn't take back, who had spent 18 months carrying the weight of that, and were now clumsily and honestly, and with significant interruption from both sides, trying to put it down. There were raised voices at one point. There was a silence at another point that lasted long enough that Abigail quietly got up and went to find Thomas's housekeeper and asked for coffee, because sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is give two stubborn men something to do with their hands while they figure out how to forgive each other. When she came back with the coffee, Jonathan and Thomas were both leaning forward with their elbows on their knees, speaking quietly, and their faces had the specific, exhausted openness of a conversation that had finally gotten to the real thing underneath all the other things. Thomas looked up when she set the coffee down. "You did that on purpose," he said. "I did," she said, and sat back down beside her husband. Jonathan reached over without looking away from his brother and put his hand over hers. It was a small gesture, unthinking, natural. The kind of thing a man does when the person beside him has become so woven into the fabric of his sense of himself that his hands know where she is without his mind directing them. Thomas saw it. He looked at his brother's hand on his wife's hand, and something in his face went quiet and glad. He did not say anything about it. He picked up his coffee. "What took her?" They stayed in Philadelphia 4 days. On the last evening after Thomas had gone to bed, and Jonathan and Abigail were sitting in the front room of Thomas's house with the fire going. October, in Philadelphia, was considerably colder than October in Virginia, a fact Abigail had noted with interest. Jonathan said something he had been thinking about for several weeks. "I want to change the estate documents," he said. Abigail looked up from the book she'd borrowed from Thomas's considerably more modest library. "What do you mean?" "The Estate Management Authority," he said. "Right now it's held entirely in my name. I want to revise it so that you hold joint authority, not as a courtesy, legally, in writing." She put the book down. "Jonathan, you have been managing this estate since September of last year," he said. "You corrected the accounts. You arranged the tenant payments. You maintained the staff. You made decisions every day that kept the property functioning while I was—" He paused elsewhere. He met her eyes. "The documents should reflect the reality. The reality is that this estate is run by both of us. The documents should say so." "That is not a small change," she said carefully. "Legally, that gives me everything you should have had from the beginning," he said. "Yes, I know." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that careful measuring look, but he knew now what was underneath. The measuring knew what she was actually asking when she looked at him that way. She wasn't asking whether he meant it. She was asking whether he understood what it meant. Whether he had thought it through clearly and arrived here by reason rather than guilt. "You've talked to Greer about this," she said. "Last week. Before you brought it up with me." "I wanted to know if it was possible before I offered it," he said. "I didn't want to offer you something I couldn't deliver. Not again." The fire moved in the grate. Outside, Philadelphia went about its business in the October cold, entirely indifferent to the conversation happening in Thomas Whitaker's front room. Abigail picked up her book, set it down again, looked at the fire for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right?" "Yes," she said, and looked at him with something warm and direct and completely unguarded, the look he had been working toward for months, without quite knowing it was what he was working toward. "All right, Jonathan." "Yes," he breathed. Something in his chest that had been holding itself carefully for a very long time let go. Kid. They came home to Virginia on a Wednesday, and the estate looked different to Jonathan. Or rather, Jonathan looked at it differently. The way you look at a place after you've been away from it long enough to see it fresh. The peach trees in the east orchard had gone bare for autumn. The roses on the south wall had finished their season. The creek was full again after the summer drought. Eleanor Mercer met them at the door. She looked at her daughter first, the way mothers do, the quick comprehensive assessment that takes in everything at once and requires no words. Then she looked at Jonathan. "You look better," she said to him. "I feel better," he said. "Philadelphia agreed with you." "Thomas agreed with me," he said. "Or I agreed with Thomas. We're still negotiating the terms." Eleanor made the sound that was her version of a laugh, not quite audible, expressed primarily in the eyes, and stepped back to let them in. That evening at supper, all four of them at the table, Jonathan, Abigail, Eleanor, and Thomas in spirit, if not in body, because Jonathan told the full story of their 4 days, and Thomas was present in every sentence of it. Abigail laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the controlled, measured expression of warmth she had offered him in the early months. A real laugh, sudden and bright at something Jonathan said about Thomas's housekeeper and her opinion of Philadelphia's weather, and it startled Jonathan so completely that he stopped talking and stared at her. Abigail registered his expression and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "I just—" He stopped, shook his head. "Nothing." But Eleanor, who missed very little, looked between them and smiled at her soup. November came in cold and serious. The estate settled into its winter rhythm. The fields were done. The accounts for the year were in order. Abigail's order, which was more thorough and more clearly annotated than any ledger the Whitaker estate had produced in the previous decade, as Greer had noted with visible admiration when he came to finalize the joint authority documents. Jonathan's hand hurt less. He didn't know when that had changed. He only noticed it one morning when he was writing to Thomas, and realized he had filled 3 pages without stopping once to rest the hand, and that the constant low ache that had been his companion since Baltimore had subsided to something he could live with, rather than something he had to manage around. He mentioned it to Abigail at breakfast. She looked at him and said, "I know." "You know, I noticed last week," she said. "You've been writing longer without stopping. Your grip is different." She tilted her head slightly. "I have been paying attention. It's a habit." He looked at her across the breakfast table, across the properly arranged breakfast that was now arranged by both of them in the sense that she had taken over the decision-making, and he had taken over the coffee, which he now made himself, because he had learned exactly how she took it and liked the doing of it, and felt the particular love of a man who has realized that being known is not a threat, but a gift. "Abigail," he said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" The question surprised her. He could see at the slight widening of her eyes the half-second before her composure reassembled itself around the surprise. She was not used to being asked. She was used to assessing happiness as a practical matter, measuring what was present against what was needed, and determining whether the balance was adequate. She was not used to someone simply asking. She thought about it seriously. He appreciated that she thought about it seriously, rather than answering immediately with the reassuring thing. "I am getting there," she said finally. "I am closer than I have ever been in this house. I am—" She paused. "I am not afraid anymore. That is significant." "What were you afraid of?" "That it would always be what it was in the beginning," she said. "That I would spend my whole life in a house where I was useful, but not seen." She held his gaze. "I am not afraid of that anymore." "Good," he said. "I intend to make sure you never have cause to be." "I know you do," she said. And then quietly, with the matter-of-fact delivery of a woman who has decided that some things do not require dramatic presentation, "I love you, Jonathan." He went very still. She kept looking at him steady and clear, not taking it back, not qualifying it, not surrounding it with conditions or caveats, just the thing itself, plain and true. "I have for a while," she said. "I did not say so because I was not sure I should trust it. I was not sure it wasn't simply proximity or gratitude or the particular vulnerability of a woman who has been lonely for a long time." She folded her hands on the table. "But it is not any of those things. I have thought about it carefully the way I think about everything carefully, and it is not. It is the real thing, so I am telling you." Jonathan set down his coffee cup. He looked at this woman. This impossible, extraordinary patient, honest, brave woman who had walked into his house with 2 trunks and a determination not to cry in front of strangers, and had proceeded quietly and without drama to rebuild everything he had let fall apart. And he felt something so complete that it had no edges, no corners, nothing left to want. "Thank you," he said, which was not the most elegant thing a man had ever said in response to a declaration of love, but it was entirely true, and she was a woman who valued truth over elegance. She laughed that real laugh again, the one that still startled him with its warmth. "You're welcome," she said, and picked up her breakfast. The twist came in December, and it came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. A letter arrived from Richmond, not from Greer, not from Thomas, but from Catherine Harrington. Catherine wrote to say that she was organizing a charitable society, a women's organization dedicated to supporting families displaced by the ongoing effects of the war, families who had lost property and income and stability and had no formal mechanism for aid. She had been thinking about it for some time. She had been waiting, she said, for the right person to help her lead it. She was writing to ask Abigail, not Jonathan, not the Whittaker family. Abigail specifically. Mrs. Abigail Whittaker, who had walked into the Harrington assembly in a red gown and dismantled a lie with her own 2 hands, and had shown Catherine Harrington exactly the kind of woman she had been looking for. Jonathan was in the study when Abigail brought him the letter. She set it on his desk without a word and stood back and watched him read it. When he looked up, she said, "I want to do it." "Then do it," he said without hesitation. "It will require time in Richmond. Travel, correspondence. It will require Abigail." He set the letter down. "Do you need my permission?" She stopped. "No," she said slowly. "I don't." "Then I am not giving you permission," he said. "I am telling you that this house, this estate, this marriage will support whatever you need in order to do this work. Fully. Without qualification." He held her gaze. "You have been holding other people's lives together your entire adult life. The fact that someone is now asking you to do it on a larger scale officially, with recognition, that is not an inconvenience to me. That is exactly what should have been available to you all along." Abigail stood very still. "You mean that?" she said, not a question. "Every word," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the letter and went to write her reply, and Jonathan sat in his study and listened to the sound of her pen moving across paper in the next room, and felt in his chest the specific and quiet rightness of a life that had finally arranged itself around the truth of what it was. It was a Thursday evening in December when Abigail walked past Jonathan's study at dusk. She was carrying a cup of tea, the good tea, the one Eleanor had brought from Richmond, and which they were rationing carefully through the winter, and she was heading to the library, as she often did in the evenings now. Her mind was already on the letter she was drafting for Catherine Harrington about the charity's first meeting on the list of families she'd compiled from Greer's contacts on the question of whether the church hall in Richmond would be large enough for the initial gathering. She was 3 steps past the study door when she heard her own name. She stopped. Not because it was unusual to hear her name in this house. She heard it regularly, now called from across the hall, spoken at breakfast, included in conversations rather than absent from them. She heard it every day. She stopped because of the way it was being said. Low, private, unhurried. The voice of a man who believed he was alone and had no reason to perform for anyone. Jonathan was praying. Lord, I ask that Abigail rests tonight. She has been working since before dawn, and she will not stop unless something stops her, and she will not ask for help, and I ask that you remind her, the way she has a gift for reminding everyone else, that she is allowed to need things. Abigail stood in the hallway of her own home, with a cup of tea going warm in her hands. I ask that Eleanor's health holds through the winter. I know Abigail worries about it, even when she doesn't say so. I ask that Thomas gets the letter before Christmas. He worries about us more than he admits, and I know now how much that costs a person. She pressed her free hand against the wall. I ask a pause. A long one. I ask that she never again feels invisible in her own home. I ask that every morning she wakes up in this house, she wakes knowing that she is seen. Fully. The way she has always deserved to be seen. I did not know how to do that when she came here. I know now. I intend to keep doing it. But I ask that you help me, because she is better than I am at most things, and I want very much not to fail her again. The hallway was absolutely silent. Abigail stood in it with her hand on the wall and her tea in her other hand, and something happening in her chest that was too large and too specific to name. Not surprise, because she had known for months who Jonathan Whittaker was when he let himself be it, but something beyond knowing something that was the difference between understanding a thing in your mind and feeling it land in your body as irrevocably true. This was the man she had prayed for through a closed door 1 year ago. This was the man she had made tea for without being thanked, and arranged breakfasts for without being seen, and written letters for without being asked, and stayed for without being given a reason to stay. He had found his way. She lifted her hand off the wall. She knocked. The sound of it, 3 quiet knocks on the study door, was the simplest thing and the most significant thing she had done since walking into this house with 2 trunks and a determination not to cry. A pause inside. Then, come in. She opened the door. Jonathan was at his desk, the candle burning low, a piece of paper in front of him that was not a letter to Thomas or an estate document, but something more private, the kind of writing a man does when he is working out what he believes by putting it on paper. He looked up. He saw the tea in her hand. He saw her face. He understood immediately that she had been in the hallway. His own face went through something, not embarrassment, but the particular vulnerability of a man whose private self has been witnessed, and who is deciding in real time that he does not mind. How long were you standing there? He said. Long enough, she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, and. She crossed the room and set the cup of tea on his desk in the cleared space to the right of the candle, the way she had done once in the morning room a long time ago, in a different version of this marriage, when she had offered him warmth and he had not known how to receive it. And, she said, pulling the second chair up beside his, not across the room, not at a proper distance, but close the way. He had pulled his chair beside hers at the desk in her sitting room, the way they had sat beside each other at Thomas's table. The way they now moved instinctively toward each other, rather than away. I thought you might want company. Jonathan looked at the tea, then at her face, then at the chair she had pulled close to his. He reached out and took the cup. I always want your company, he said. I just didn't know how to say so. I know, she said. You're learning. I am, he said. I have a very good teacher. Abigail settled into the chair beside him. Outside, December pressed cold against the windows. Inside, the candle held its small circle of warmth. Eleanor was in the east wing, probably reading. Thomas was in Philadelphia, probably writing his reply to Jonathan's last letter. Greer had sent word last week that Silas had paid the debt in full and had not been heard from in Richmond since September. The charity's first meeting was in 3 weeks, and Abigail already had 14 families on her list. Jonathan wrapped both hands around the T. His right hand and his left hand, the one that hurt and the one that didn't, and felt the warmth come through. "What were you writing?" she asked. "Thinking out loud," he said. "Trying to understand what kind of man I want to be for the next 30 years. Have you arrived at any conclusions?" He looked at her. "A few." "Tell me." "Well, the kind who asks," he said, "who shows up, who stays at the table after breakfast is done." He held her gaze. "The kind who deserves the woman sitting beside him." Abigail looked at him in the candlelight, and her face was completely open, no armor, no measuring, no distance. Just her. Just this. "You're already that man," she said. "You have been for a while. You just needed to believe it." The candle burned. The study held them both in its small warm circle of light, and in the Whitaker house, the house she had held together alone, and was now holding together with him, two people who had begun as strangers, who had nearly lost each other to silence and pride, and the particular cruelty of not paying attention, sat shoulder to shoulder in the December dark. Not as a transaction, not as an arrangement, not as duty dressed up as marriage, as two people who had found their way to each other through the most ordinary and most difficult path available. Honesty time and the daily choice to stay. Jonathan Whitaker had walked past his wife's door 1,000 nights without once stopping to knock. Abigail Whitaker had prayed for a man who had not yet earned it, and waited for him to become someone who had. And on a Thursday evening in December,